the velvet lining of the gift box sent by my mother-in-law. It was her 11th birthday, a day that should have been filled with laughter, cake, and the bright, messy joy of childhood. Instead, the color completely drained from Lily's face, her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed onto the living room rug before she could even utter a sound. The wrapped box fell from her hands, spilling its bizarre, sickening contents across the floor. My husband, Julian, didn't waste a second. Pale with sheer terror, he scooped our breathless daughter into his arms and bolted out the front door to rush her to the ER, leaving me behind in a house that suddenly felt entirely too quiet. But the true nightmare began 4 hours later. When the heavy front door finally clicked open, Julian wasn't alone. He walked back into our home flanked by 5 grim-faced police officers and 4 high-powered defense lawyers. Hi, my name is Eleanor, and if you want to know how a simple birthday package from a grandmother turned into a full-scale criminal investigation that dismantled my entire family, follow me at the city you're watching from right now so I can see exactly how far my story has reached. The funeral flowers of my marriage to Julian's family might as well have been delivered the day I met Martha. She was a woman carved out of old money and cold judgment, a matriarch who ruled her family business and her sons with a velvet-gloved iron fist. For 12 years, she treated me like an invasive species, an outsider who had dared to dilute her precious family bloodline. But I never imagined her malice would extend to her own granddaughter. The morning of Lily's 11th birthday was bright, filled with the sweet aroma of vanilla cupcakes and the chaotic rustle of wrapping paper. Lily was laughing, her bright eyes reflecting the pure, untainted joy of childhood. Then the doorbell rang. A courier delivered a heavy parcel wrapped in elegant, thick black paper, tied with a pristine silver ribbon. The tag read, "To Lily from grandmother. A piece of family history." Julian looked surprised, even touched. "Look at that, Elle," he whispered, squeezing my shoulder. "Maybe she's finally coming around." Lily eagerly pulled the ribbon away, tearing through the heavy paper. Inside sat an exquisite, antique silver box, covered in intricate, dark carvings of twisting vines and locked tightly with a heavy latch. Beside it lay a strange, vintage glass medical syringe and a piece of faded, yellowed parchment paper. "What is this, Mommy?" Lily asked, her forehead wrinkling in confusion. Before I could answer, Lily flipped the silver latch open. The moment her small fingers brushed the plush, deep red velvet lining of the box, the room changed. A strange, heavy stillness hung in the air. I watched in absolute horror as the bright color completely drained from Lily's cheeks. Her vibrant blue eyes suddenly rolled back into her head, and her small frame went completely limp. She collapsed onto the living room rug like a dropped doll, the bizarre antique box clattering beside her, spilling its sickening contents across the floor. The silence that followed the screech of Julian's tires fading down the street was a heavy, suffocating weight. I stood frozen in the center of the living room, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The festive birthday banners dangling from the ceiling suddenly looked grotesque, mocking the absolute nightmare that had just unfolded. My hands shook violently as I grabbed my phone, dialing Julian's number. Ring. Ring. Voicemail. I slammed it down and tried again. Nothing. The agonizing isolation began to morph from sharp panic into a cold, hard focus. I couldn't just sit here and drown in my own terror. I needed to know what had just broken my daughter. Walking into the kitchen, I pulled a pair of heavy rubber cleaning gloves over my trembling hands. My instincts, honed by years of surviving Martha's subtle, psychological warfare, were screaming that this was no accident. I knelt on the rug beside the scattered birthday gifts, my eyes locking onto the antique silver box. As I leaned closer, a faint, bittersweet chemical odor hit the back of my throat. It was subtle, masked by the musty scent of old metal, but it burned my nostrils, a clinical, industrial smell that felt entirely out of place in a child's toy. Using a small plastic ruler, I carefully tipped the box over. The plush red velvet lining looked ordinary, but when I pressed against the bottom panel, a sharp click echoed through the quiet room. A false bottom popped open. Hidden inside were tightly folded sheets of onion skin paper. I carefully pulled them out, smoothing them on the coffee table. My heart stopped. These weren't family heirlooms. They were old bank logs from offshore accounts, secret corporate identity files, and a legal trust document with Lily's name printed in bold letters at the top. Beneath it was a signature that looked like a clumsy, desperate forgery of my own handwriting. The heavy click of the front door unlocking felt like a gunshot in the silent house. I bolted to my feet, expecting Julian to run in with an update on Lily. Instead, the door swung wide, and Julian stepped into the entryway looking entirely hollow, his face a mask of absolute shock. But it was the crowd behind him that made my breath catch in my throat. 5 grim-faced, uniformed police officers filed into our living room, followed closely by 4 men and women in impeccably tailored charcoal suits. They carried heavy leather briefcases and moved with a cold, intimidating precision. "Julian, what is happening? Where is Lily?" I cried out, my voice cracking under the weight of the panic. Julian rushed forward, catching my shaking shoulders. "She's stable, Elle. She's at the hospital, but they have her under a 24-hour guard. Nobody gets in or out of her room." Before I could even process his words, one of the suited individuals stepped forward. She was a sharp woman with piercing gray eyes and a severe haircut. "Mrs. Whitaker, my name is Beatrice Vance," she said, her voice dropping into a calm, authoritative tone. "I am a senior defense attorney, and these are my associates. Your husband retained our firm 2 hours ago from the emergency room. I need you to step away from the birthday gifts immediately. This house is now an official crime scene." The lead police officer stepped up beside her, already pulling a roll of yellow crime scene tape from his belt. "Ma'am, the hospital's toxicology report came back 20 minutes ago," the officer explained, his voice deadly serious. "Your daughter didn't have a medical episode. The plush velvet lining of that antique box was intentionally treated with a concentrated, highly regulated industrial sedative vapor. It was designed to flash evaporate into an incapacitating cloud the exact second the airtight latch was broken. If Lily had opened that package in a small, enclosed space like her bedroom, she might not have survived." Julian sank into the worn leather armchair, burying his face in his hands as a ragged sob escaped his chest. The 4 lawyers stood around us like a protective wall, while the police officers began setting up evidence markers on our living room rug. "It was my mother, Elle." Julian choked out, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and pure rage. "The doctors found traces of a highly restricted pharmaceutical compound. When the hospital flagged it, the legal team dug into Martha's corporate logistics. They found the paper trail." Beatrice Vance opened a thick manila folder on the coffee table, gesturing to the corporate hierarchy charts inside. "Mrs. Whitaker, your mother-in-law's multi-million-dollar logistics empire is an absolute house of cards," Beatrice explained, her voice sharp and clinical. "Over the last decade, Martha has been drowning in catastrophic bad debt. To hide the financial bleeding from her board of directors, she needed a ghost entity, a clean slate that would never trigger federal suspicion. She chose Lily." My blood ran cold as the pieces began to fit together. "Lily? She's 11 years old." "Exactly," Beatrice replied. "Martha used Lily's social security number and clean identity from the day she was born to establish a series of offshore shell companies. She funneled over $12 million of toxic debt and fraudulent loans into your daughter's name. But Martha made a critical miscalculation. When Lily turned 11 today, a specific clause in the family's original estate trust automatically triggered an independent, external audit. By Monday morning, federal investigators would have uncovered the identity theft and corporate embezzlement." Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot. The syringe, the box, the treated velvet, it was a horrific setup. If Lily was hospitalized or declared mentally incapacitated due to a sudden substance exposure in our home, Martha's lawyers could legally petition to freeze the audit indefinitely. She was going to destroy our daughter's life, frame us for negligence, and lock Lily away in a facility just to protect her stolen fortune. The living room transformed into a high-stakes command center as the police officers systematically secured the area. Flashbulbs illuminated the dim space, casting eerie shadows against the walls as a forensics officer bagged the antique silver box. The chemical-soaked red velvet and the forged onion skin documents were carefully sealed into plastic evidence pouches, creating a definitive paper trail of Martha's cruelty. Meanwhile, Beatrice Vance and her legal team were a whirlwind of focused, calculated action. Sitting at our dining table, laptops open, they coordinated directly with a federal judge. Within 30 minutes, using the overwhelming physical evidence gathered from our home, they successfully obtained emergency asset freezing orders. Warrants were issued to block Martha's personal accounts and corporate funds before she could realize the plot had failed and attempt to flee the country. The scene shifted dramatically to the downtown police precinct later that evening. Martha had been brought in for emergency questioning, intercepted by authorities at a private airfield. Even sitting in a stark, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, she maintained her icy, arrogant demeanor, dressed in a pristine designer coat that cost more than our car. When confronted with the forensic toxicology data and the forged trust documents, Martha didn't flinch. Instead, she laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that echoed uncomfortably off the metal table. She looked directly at the lead detective and casually attempted to brush the entire life-threatening event away as a tragic domestic misunderstanding. With a patronizing sneer, she claimed that I was simply a paranoid, gold-digging outsider who was manipulating Julian to ruin her reputable family name. But as Beatrice stepped into the room with the federal freezing orders in hand, the color finally began to fade from the matriarch's heavily made-up face. While Martha sat under the harsh glare of the interrogation lights, Beatrice's associates remained stationed at our dining table, meticulously combing through the seized corporate files and digital servers. It was just after midnight when a sudden, heavy silence fell over the room. One of the junior lawyers stared blankly at his screen, his face turning an ash-gray color. "Eleanor, Julian, you need to look at this," he whispered, turning the laptop toward us. What appeared on the screen was a deeply encrypted, archived medical file dating back nearly 8 years, the exact period surrounding the sudden passing of Julian's father. The public record had always stated he succumbed to a rapid, unpreventable heart condition. But the internal corporate logs painted a far more sinister picture. Hidden within the deleted data folders were unauthorized digital transfers to a private chemical laboratory, accompanied by a secret codicil that altered his original will just 3 days before his death. Julian leaned heavily against a table, his breath catching in his throat as the sickening realization washed over him. Martha hadn't just started cutting corners recently. She had utilized a nearly identical method of subtle, untraceable chemical manipulation to incapacitate his father, forcing him to sign over full control of the family fortune before his heart gave out entirely. Julian's entire reality shattered in that single moment. The deep respect and fierce loyalty he had maintained for his mother his entire life had been built on a foundation of horrific lies and corporate bloodshed. He wasn't just protecting a grandmother who made a mistake. He was looking at a lifelong monster. Armed with this explosive new discovery, Beatrice and her team spent the rest of the night finalizing an ironclad, multi-layered criminal indictment that combined corporate fraud, grand larceny, and felony child endangerment, completely sealed